Hello and welcome to I Know Dino. I'm Garrett.
And I'm Sabrina.
And today in our 361st episode, we have a bunch of news, including a new sauropod from Patagonia. We also have an interview with Edward Guimont about how dinosaurs are connected to myths and legends. And we have Dinosaur of the Day, Fabrosaurus. But before we get into all of that, as always, we like to thank some of our patrons for keeping our podcast running. And this week we want to thank Ankylosaurus, Stegosaurus Noah, Arlosaurus, Misunderstood Oviraptor, Rogan, Bodhicephaly, Albertosaurus, Robert, Ellen, and Velociraptor.
Awesome. Yes, thank you so much for being our patrons. As a quick reminder, if you're a dinosaur enthusiast in our Patreon community, next week is the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology Conference, and we have promised all of our patrons that we will do some extra content around the non-dinosaurs that are covered in the conference, in the talks. We're not sure exactly which non-dinosaurs they are yet, but, you know, think mosasaurs, pterosaurs, those kinds of exciting animals.
Think about whatever you're most excited about. They might be included.
Yeah. Can't promise, but it'll be something non-dinosaur.
Basically, whatever the most exciting non-dinosaur talks we see are.
So it's not too late to join. You just go to patreon.com/iknowdino.
So jumping into the news, we've got our new sauropod, and this paper was published in Cretaceous Research, written by Mauro Rolando and others. And in it, they describe an entirely new sauropod site with several species, including a freshly named sauropod.
Nice.
So it's not just a new sauropod, it's actually a whole site.
Of sauropods?
Yeah, pretty much.
Excellent.
It's from the Rio Negro province in Patagonia, Argentina. And more broadly, that's a part of the Allen Formation, which is in the Maastrichtian. So it's in the latest Cretaceous, the very end of the Cretaceous. And as expected, since we're talking about sauropods in the end of the Cretaceous in South America, we're talking about titanosaurs. So the fauna includes a lot of great material. They identified a Rocasaurus, which is a saltosaurid, and that's a previously named dinosaur, Rocasaurus.
Mm-hmm.
Saltosaurids as a group, as the authors describe them, are, quote, small and robustly built taxa that had facultative bipedalism, end quote.
Oh, interesting. End of the Cretaceous and facultative bipedalism.
Yeah, they were like...
on two legs.
They're reverting to their sauropodomorph ancestors, shrinking down.
Yeah.
Going on two legs, except they were, as they said, robustly built, which is different than the early sauropodomorphs in a lot of cases.
True.
And they had osteoderms. A lot of them did, which is also very different than the early sauropodomorphs.
Yeah.
Those are probably my favorite sauropods.
I wonder why.
The small, robustly built ones with osteoderms. That sounds like another type of dinosaur.
Yeah. Sounds tank-like, if you ask me.
They also found remains of a probable Eolosaurine, or maybe Eolosaurines, because it's always hard to know how many individuals the bones came from, but not always. In this case, it is. That group includes Gondwanatitan and Rapatosaurus, but as the authors put it, Eolosaurines are, quote, medium-sized, slender-limbed titanosaurs.
So you've got small, robust ones, sauropods, and then medium-sized, slender ones.
Slender-limbed.
Slender-limbed.
Not necessarily slender in the body
part.
Oh,
I see. Right. Because they're still a titanosaur.
Yeah. Well, I mean, titanosaurs can be small. They don't have to be beefy.
It's just interesting you got the two living together.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot of diversity in this fauna, and those Eolosaurines also likely had relatively stiff tails as another sort of unique trait about them that you would notice by looking at it. They, of course, both have tons of unique features if you look at the bones and look for little bumps and ridges here and there, but it's a little too technical. They also found at least 4 types of osteoderms in the fauna, and they could be just from one individual, because one individual can have a lot of osteoderms, and on different parts of the body, sometimes they look very different, but probably not, because these include both bulb and root, as well as keeled osteoderms, which aren't usually included on the same animal. So that's sort of the non-new dinosaur. That's like the existing taxa information from the fauna. But the new dinosaur is named Menucocelsior. Ariagatae, and the name Menucocelsior comes from both Menuco, which is the Mapudungun word for water hole, because it was found at Salitral Ojo de Agua, and Ojo de Agua roughly translates to water hole. So, I mean, it has that same kind of meaning. So then they tried to include the place name in a clever way, and they used a local language to do that and came up with Menuco. And the authors translate Celsior from Latin as major, although usually it's translated as taller or loftier. So basically what you have is the tall one at the watering hole, if you combine the name and translate it to English.
Sounds like a good description.
Yeah. So that's the genus name. And then the species name, Ariagatae, is after Beto Ariagata and his family as, quote, the owners of the farm that includes the fossil sites here reported, which are also enthusiastic on preserving fossils from the area and usually help us to find fossil sites during our field trips, end quote.
Nice.
So they sound like a good group of dinosaur or paleo enthusiasts that happen to own a bunch of lands that have dinosaurs on them and other fossils.
Sounds like a good collaboration.
It does. I can see why they named a dinosaur after them. So based on its name and being considered lofty or tall, you might think that it's tall like a Brachiosaurus, but it's definitely not. It is maybe taller than the other things that have been found at Saltrial Ojo de Agua, at that site, you know, these couple other individuals. And it's probably taller than some of the other previous animals that aren't sauropods from the area, which include alvarezsaurids, hadrosaurids, ornithopods, and sauropod nests, which obviously aren't very tall, as well as pterosaurs and plesiosaurs. But the sauropod nests didn't include any bones, so it's like we could tell that it was a nesting site, but we couldn't tell what the animals were, or obviously how big they were. So out of the fauna, the only named taxa of a sauropod other than Menucocelsior is Rocasaurus, which was about 8 meters or 26 feet long when it was alive, which is not very big, especially for a sauropod.
The small, robust one, yeah.
But Menucocelsior, in their skeletal, appears to be a little bit bigger, maybe. It looked, when I measured it, it rounded to 8 meters, but it was rounding down to 8 meters. So maybe it's a little bit over 8 meters. It's a very rough estimate because I had to base it on just like sort of a rough outline and like, you know, a scale bar converted over into the skeletal from a different measurement somewhere else and all that. But I always like to give a rough size estimate. So it's probably about the same size as Rocasaurus, but maybe it's a little bit bigger. And that might be why they added the Celsior part to it to make it like, because it's the biggest one, maybe. And for the record, it was roughly, again, 2.7 meters or 9 feet tall at its hips. So that puts it between the heights of an adult female and an adult male African elephant.
Oh, yeah, that's not that large for a sauropod.
No. The authors generously describe it, though, as a mid-sized titanosaur, where it's like mid-sized African elephant height. Doesn't seem like a mid-sized titanosaur to me, but I guess there are smaller titanosaurs and there are bigger ones, so then that makes this mid-sized. I also want to point out, even though this specific site doesn't have larger titanosaurs, they are known from the broader Allen Formation, including Arutatitan maximus, which is about 15 meters or 49 feet long, obviously way bigger than Menucocelsior.
Well, that's a large one, not a mid-sized one.
I feel like even that is just on the larger size of mid, because they can get over 100 feet long. So
That's
49
true.
feet long, it's like, yeah, it's pretty big.
The over 100 feet ones are ginormous size.
Yeah, that's true. A lot of them are in that colossorial group. The Menucocelsior holotype includes a few useful bones. The best part is probably the tail vertebrae. There are 17 of them in total, but there are gaps in between them, and they weren't really articulated, and they're sort of scattered around. But based on their sizes, they sort of fit them together into where they probably were in the tail. And basically, they're in 4 sets. There were 3 by the hips. They're sure about 2 of them, and they're like, probably the third one was also the next one in the series. And then there were also groups of 3, 6, and 5 vertebrae, respectively, as you go towards the tip of the tail. So a couple of little smatterings here and there, which was useful. It's especially useful to figure out the overall length of the animal, since tail can be up to half of a dinosaur easily. They also found the right humerus, left fibula, and an incomplete foot bone to go along with the tail vertebrae.
All right. Not a bad find.
No, it's pretty good. Especially for a sauropod. You know, you've got a few limb bones and a lot of vertebrae. You can do a lot with that information. It'd be nice to have a skull and have the hips, too. That would tell us a lot more information. But it was enough to find some unique details, so that's why it ended up getting a new name.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the interesting details about its description, which were partly the justification for it being a unique dinosaur genus, is that it had a stout humerus with a large ridge, and that is, quote-unquote, probably unique to Menucocelsior. Although, interestingly, even though it had a large ridge, presumably for a different muscle attachment, it had a short deltopectoral crest, which is the main muscle attachment point that we usually talk about on the humerus. So that's kind of weird. It also had a fibula described as short and stout, and it had rod-like and triangular projections from the side of its first two tail vertebrae.
Defense, maybe?
No, those are like attachment points for ligaments and stuff like that. They didn't project that far. They just projected a little bit, probably still within the meat of the tail. Although, I guess, I don't know, maybe, sure, if they grow really long, you could have some defense there. It wouldn't be a bad place to have a defensive spine. They classify Menucocelsior as a Eutitanosaur, which is a group that includes most of these titanosaurs. It doesn't seem to be a Saltosaurine, Eolosaurine, or Colosaurine, which are the three major groups, or three of the major groups in Eutitanosauria. But Menucocelsior is in good company because there are a lot of other Eutitanosaurs that aren't in those groups. So there's the phylogeny is a big old mess. So they didn't even do that much of a phylogeny with this one, probably because it doesn't fit nicely into one of those groups. They mostly just talked about overall, like we see this number of this type of group and this number of this type of group. And it basically led to the conclusion you said earlier, which is look at them all coexisting, these different types of sauropods all over the place.
Mm-hmm. What a nice place it must have been.
Yeah. And there were a lot of places like it. It wasn't just the Saltrial Ojo de Agua formation. There are lots of examples of different fauna around Patagonia that have multiple of these types of sauropods in them. The authors think, as you might assume, they probably could coexist because they occupied different niches, presumably eating different food or otherwise separating out, so that they weren't constantly competing for the exact same food, because then you'd expect one of them to win out eventually. And in case you're curious, the Menucocelsior holotype is housed at the Natural Science Museum of Patagonia in the same province where it was found.
Cool. Another museum on our list of museums we want to see.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a big one that comes up a lot.
Yeah, think of the sauropods.
That's true. It is largely sauropods there.
Moving on from sauropods, I mean, I could talk about sauropods all day, but there are other dinosaurs, I suppose, to talk about. There's an update on Pops the ceratopsian. That's the ceratopsian in Weld County, Colorado. We last talked about Pops in episode 243, so it's been a little while. As a quick recap, Pops was found in 1982 and donated to Weld County, and then they had a public contest to name the skull. And that's how Pops became Pops. And last fall, Pops was moved to the Denver Museum of Nature and Science to be cleaned up and restored, and that work is now done.
So you can see Pops? Or maybe you could see Pops the whole time?
Not yet. Oh, I think you're right. I think you could have seen Pops being cleaned up, but they're going to make a replica first, and then Pops will go back on display at Weld County, and they're going to have a new case in the lobby, and there'll be some artwork around Pops.
Nice.
Yeah. So they found a lot of other fossils when they moved Pops to clean up and restore, including 20 ribs and Pops' lower jaw. So now Pops has a complete skull.
Wow, that's really good.
Yeah. And Joe Sertich, who led the team cleaning up Pops, said that based on some features of the skull, Pops may not be a Triceratops. I used to think Pops was definitely Triceratops, but instead could be an Eotriceratops or an entirely new species. They need to do some studies and eventually, hopefully, they'll publish about it. Oh, also, Pops is about 1.5 to 2 million years older than other known Triceratops fossils, so that makes it seem like maybe Pops isn't a Triceratops.
That is along the limits of how long a species usually lasts, or I guess it's more than average. That's what I should say, because 2 million years is around the average length that a species is around.
Yeah.
So when you start to get longer than 2 million years before the last known Triceratops, then yeah, could be its own thing.
Pops could be a Pops to Triceratops.
Meh, good one.
Although that's so hard to prove, but it's fun to think about. So in North Dakota, there's two big items. The Dickinson Museum Center's Badlands Dinosaur Museum is getting a tyrannosaur skeleton. It's 76 million years old. It's in a block right now that weighs between 9,000 and 13,000 pounds. It's 8 by 10 foot block.
Oh, man.
Mm-hmm.
That's like about the size of the Utah raptor block. I think that was like in that range. Or maybe it was twice that big.
I thought the Utah raptor block was 10 by 10. But I don't remember how much it weighs.
And I think that one also was sort of like a cube.
Mm-hmm.
So this is 8 by 10, but it's probably not 10 feet thick. It's probably only like 2 or 3 feet thick.
I'm not sure exactly. They found the skeleton. They found the feet and the ankle sticking out of a cliff in 2017, and they've been excavating 2018 and 2019. They know the skeleton's on its side. It fell into a river, washed up on a riverbank. That's according to Denver Fowler. And it's curled up, which may mean that the skeleton's pretty intact, but it's hard to tell because it's still in the block. And they found 3 other tyrannosaur skeletons in the area, and 2 of the 4 have been airlifted to the museum. So visitors can see the tyrannosaur being prepared over the next 2 years in a public viewing lab.
Nice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's close to the ideal, right? You see like a foot sticking out of a cliff, and then you hope that as you dig back, you've got the whole rest of the animal. That's what you want, like one of the ends, like the end of a limb or the end of the tail or the end of the snout or something. And then,
Yeah, that'd be cool if it ends up being a fully complete tyrannosaur.
It would be. I mean, if it's that big of a block, there's probably a lot of bones in there.
Mm-hmm. So the second item for North Dakota, the North Dakota Heritage Center and State Museum in Bismarck has updated their Dakota the Dino Mummy exhibit. This is a 67-million-year-old mummified juvenile or teenaged Edmontosaurus, and it's been cleaned and being prepared for the last 3 years. It was found in 1999 by Tyler Lyson, who found it on his uncle's ranch, and then excavated in 2004. So it'd been on display before from 2008 to 2018, but the new display, you can see skin with scales and fingernails. You can see an arm and the tail now. And the hips and the neck, they're still in a block and being prepared. They'll be displayed later. And if you're visiting, you can take tours to see the preparation.
Cool.
Mm-hmm.
I like how they describe it as scales and fingernails.
Yeah.
It makes them sound not nearly as beefy as they were fingernails.
Oh, true. I was thinking that makes them sound more mummified for some reason.
Yeah, it's more like claw sheets. Because even Edmontosaurus had some decent claws.
Yeah. I always like it when you can see the skin.
Oh, yeah. That's amazing.
So our last item, there's another step taken in Podokesaurus becoming the state dinosaur of Massachusetts. The House passed the legislation on October 15th, and the next step is the Senate in Massachusetts. The last step was the State Administration and Regulatory Oversight Committee voting to move it forward to the House. I didn't realize there were so many steps, although maybe I should have because we've talked about dinosaurs becoming state dinosaurs before.
Yes.
So after that, there's one more vote in each chamber, and then the governor will sign it. And it sounds like it's progressing pretty quickly.
Non-controversial legislation. Everybody loves dinosaurs.
Everybody wants a state dinosaur.
That too. They're falling behind. Got to catch up, Massachusetts.
They're working on it.
And now we're going to go on to our interview with Dr. Edward Guimont. But in case you want to hear more of this and you're a patron, check out your premium content feed because, as always, we talked longer than we had originally intended and had lots of other good content in there. So we couldn't fit it all into the episode, but definitely check it out.
That's what happens when you get a few dinosaur enthusiasts together.
Yeah, it does happen pretty much every time. We're joined this week by Dr. Edward Guimont. He's an assistant professor of world history at Bristol Community College, and we're talking to him today because there's some really interesting different aspects of paleontology that he's talked about in the past.
But also like prehistoric animals and kind of myths and legends and all kinds of interesting connections.
Absolutely.
Cool. So I guess let's start first with the article that's a bit more about the dinosaurs, the hunting dinosaurs in Central Africa. It looks like it came out a couple years ago, and you mentioned that was originally part of your dissertation?
Yeah, so this was part of my dissertation, which I should say I'm not a paleontologist, I'm not even technically a historian of science. I think technically my field is modern Europe, but it's pretty wide-ranging. But my dissertation was focused on this city in what is now the country of Zimbabwe, Great Zimbabwe, which the country is now named after. But this was a city that thrived in the Middle Ages. It went into decline right around the time Europeans started to arrive in southeastern Africa. And so it led to a lot of discussions about the origins of the city because there were many legends already springing up around the time, first with the Arabs, then the Portuguese, the Dutch, the Germans, the British. All of them had different interpretations of who had, quote, really built this city. And so this was something that I kind of spun off of an earlier version of my dissertation. It was a very meandering topic. But using this city, I kind of looked at a lot of issues of, pseudo-history and settler colonial politics in broadly the British Empire and to a wider extent the US as well. But from looking through all of the various ways that different regimes have kind of, tried to invent their own history and tie it in with Great Zimbabwe, I kind of, through discovery found that one of the most popular theories of where the city came from were that the ancient Israelites had gone to South Africa and that this had been the city of Ophir mentioned in the Bible, built by King Solomon. And so there's a lot of the versions of the history of Great Zimbabwe have this Old Testament connection to it, which then, through looking at some of these connections, I came across, some interpretations linking this with the book of Daniel and the infamous story of the lion's den, and how in some versions of the book of Daniel, it's not just a lion, but a dragon, and how people had, argued this dragon was connected with a dragon from Babylonian mythology, the Sirash, which then, of course, had to have come from Central Africa, because, obviously this is where the, Middle Easterners at the time were getting all their gold and diamonds from this historical interpretation. So therefore, there had to have been some kind of, giant dragon in, Central Africa at the time. And then this tied in with other claimed sightings of giant lizards from big game hunters. And then this ultimately ties in with this legendary creature of the indigenous peoples of the area called the Mokele Mbembe. So this all essentially gets tied together to the argument that the Mokele Mbembe is a living dinosaur, and it got brought to the Middle East by the ancient Israelites who built Great Zimbabwe. And, you have this Old Testament prophet who's, fighting dinosaurs in ancient Babylonia through this, very tangled mix of speculation and actual history and colonial politics and, Bible studies, all kind of just getting churned together in a way which sounds fantastic, but really, it's through my work, it's a lot more common than you might think in a lot of colonial era political worldviews.
That's really interesting. I think we talked a little bit about Mokele Mbembe before, and I feel like the legend I remembered, it wasn't in Zimbabwe, but it was more central, like in Democratic Republic of the Congo, or like sort of that area. Is it just sort of like a vague somewhere in Africa thing? Or
it's interesting because, this shows also kind of, the European view of Africa, where a lot of the stuff that, we now interpret as the Mokele Mbembe early on came out of Zimbabwe, Zambia area sightings, which then got associated with the term Mokele Mbembe, which is, generally from further northwest. And then, sometimes you'll see it associated with sightings in Ghana and that area.
Jeez,
so
far.
It's essentially, it's become kind of like, I think there may be a charitable way to interpret it as, a Pan-African myth, and perhaps a less charitable, maybe more accurate way of interpreting it as, to Europeans, Africa is just, the same place. Of course, Congo, Zimbabwe, Ghana. No, what's the difference?
Just a couple thousand miles.
Right, yeah.
Like all of Europe.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
So then how did it end up being thought of as a dinosaur?
Well, so you have at the time, there are a lot of big game hunters, I know, obviously going to Africa because, this is, where a lot of the big megafauna still exist, especially in the 19th century. And you start to get reports from a lot of the hunters in the area that, oh, I saw this giant creature in the bush. And then, I asked the natives to draw a picture of it for me. And, it's they drew a brontosaurus. And, it always starts off as a brontosaurus, partly because, this is also, especially it's getting tied in a bit with Arthur Conan Doyle's The Lost World, which also is kind of a case zero for a lot of these types of living dinosaur monster sightings. So in some cases, it's building off the idea that there are these giant lizards that big game hunters are either claiming they saw or think they saw, or maybe saw part of an animal and, had it drawn from them. But the key thing is they're then turning to the lore of the indigenous peoples in the area and trying to extrapolate out of that, which of course then comes to the problem of, some of them are not so good at the indigenous languages. So there's stuff getting lost in the translation, stuff possibly being deliberately, misidentified in translation from either side. Especially later on, there's a factor of, again, whether deliberately or, accidentally or just through shrewd business, a lot of the indigenous people know that, or these people are coming to try and find, dinosaurs. So, all right, we're going to draw some dinosaurs for them to make them happy. So some general mix of this, but it's essentially, the argument that these, from the European point of view, these indigenous peoples who had just been, cut off from civilization, they have no knowledge of fossils at all, but they're drawing these dinosaurs. Obviously, therefore, it's proof that dinosaurs are real and that, this giant gray creature I saw in the river was really a brontosaurus and not, just a hippopotamus or something like that.
Yeah. That's interesting. That reminds me a lot of like Loch Ness, where it's like the whole industry there is like, yeah, sure, maybe there's something there. It's like all the people there have never seen anything, but they're happy to have tourists come through, so they'll keep, feeding the fire, I guess.
And one of the big sightings in Loch Ness, one of the first big early waves, it happens right after the release of King Kong, which features a plesiosaur. And that's kind of right when the Loch Ness monster, which originally it was kind of originally identified more as a hippopotamus type thing. Like the first few like modern Loch Ness monster sightings, it's walking around on land. It's after King Kong comes out, which has this plesiosaur battle. That's when the Loch Ness monster transforms into a plesiosaur in kind of the public imagination.
It's like Aliens. Aliens always look like the most recent movie version of an alien.
Yeah.
Somehow that happens.
It sounded like in your article, too, what kind of fueled this was the discovery a fisherman caught a coelacanth in 1938 or something, and people thought, oh, we thought that was extinct. What else could be not extinct?
Exactly. Of course, they're finding it in Africa, too, and Africa's, long-standing association of a place that's mysterious, a place that's cut off from civilization, a place that's, cut off from evolution, or, even if you follow the polygenist account of human origins, I guess, there are people into the 20th century arguing that, its evolution is completely separate in Africa from elsewhere in the world. So there's these long-standing colonialist notions of Africa as, it's an unknown place compared to Europe or even Asia or the Americas to some extent. And so therefore, of course, if there's going to be a living dinosaur, it's going to be in Africa. And that's why when they find the coelacanth, this thing that, to Europeans had been, thought extinct for millions of years. I mean, local African fishermen, they know about it mainly as something to avoid catching, because apparently if you eat coelacanth, I guess it makes you vomit.
Ooh.
So it was essentially just this fish that none of them wanted. And then all of a sudden, to Europeans, it's this new discovery that proves that, creatures out of time can exist in Africa.
What I found really interesting too is, and I guess I never really thought about how these stories started, or at least didn't think too much about them and the, all the things that came together. But we've got movies, like recent movies about stuff like this, like, I guess 1984, Baby, Secret of the Lost Legend. Garrett and I watched something that I had to look it up. I guess it's from 2014 called Dinosaur Island. And it's like a boy's on an island with dinosaurs. And then it's a little bit different. There's like a girl who I guess got stuck there from the 1950s, but it's still like, I think it was in Africa and there's dinosaurs.
Yeah.
Yep. You got like the Dinotopia books in the 90s. Those were very popular.
Oh, those are my favorite.
Yeah.
Yeah, that whole Lost World. I feel like Dinotopia was sort of a combination of Lost World with like the Shangri-La Lost Horizon style.
Absolutely.
Where it's like, I prefer that. It's not like hunting and like capturing. It's more just like, look at these people coexisting peacefully with dinosaurs all this time.
Yeah, but there's so many of these kinds of stories and they've been coming out like fairly consistently.
Yeah. Clearly people want to believe that dinosaurs are still around and imagine what it would be like.
They have some, like even from the start of, fossils being identified in the 19th century. I've seen it in a few Victorian era novels, arguing that, pterodactyls are actually, the origin of dragons. So there is this almost from the start, this big desire to see that dinosaurs are part of this myth. I know J.R.R. Tolkien, in one of his letters, he was talking about how the fell beasts from Lord of the Rings are, intended to kind of be pterodactyls or similar. And he was talking about, I think it's like the new mythology of paleontology. And he's drawing on this idea of geological history as it's being discovered and tying it in with his whole fantasy timeline. So right there, we have all this stuff, probably like the biggest, like most epic myth, or I guess artificial myth. I guess all myths are artificial, but Lord of the Rings, even that's tying in elements of, what if dinosaurs survived and then join the dark side, I guess.
Yeah, that's awesome. I never realized, because it's again my version of the fell beasts, or the dragon things, the ring racer riding. I think of the movie version because I saw that young enough that it's like, well, that's what they look like. And those were like crazy, way bigger than pterosaurs. Don't look really much like any sort of extinct creature. It's interesting that Tolkien was thinking that it was maybe more like an actual living creature than this insane thing that they came up with for the movie.
I've heard that, and I don't know a ton about his personal life, but I have heard that he was an amateur fossil hunter, like in England, and he's originally from South Africa, I believe, too. So he may have been following the news of the coelacanth. Although, I guess by then that was around when he was writing The Hobbit. So
yeah, yeah, he seems like a really interesting guy. That's one of those, like, if you could have a dinner party with,
someone from the past,
Tolkien would definitely be in the mix.
Well, especially because he's hanging out with C.S. Lewis too. So like Dennis, the two big minds of like modern fantasy were like friends with each other.
Yeah, that's crazy.
And so your article also mentioned Tarzan comics and Tom Swift books.
Yeah, it's I guess they're going to be making a new TV show out of him. He was like the boy genius inventor type guy from the 1960s, and my local library had all of those books. So I actually did read the one with, and it wasn't called Mokele Mbembe, but it definitely tied in with the notion of the African continents hiding these dinosaurs. Although, as I believe in that book, it was actually some like geneticist had gone into Africa to like rebirth dinosaurs. But it ends also with them setting aside a nature preserve to create a place for these reanimated dinosaurs to so it's kind of predicting Jurassic Park. And of course, Tarzan is there. I believe like in the 90s, before Disney bought Marvel Comics, I guess there's still some like Disney comic that I don't really know, but like there's some the Lion King spin-off comic where Simba meets the Mokele Mbembe.
What?
Yeah.
I gotta find that.
It's I tried find it's it's some 20-year-old like obscure Disney comic, and it's just actually like you mentioned the baby the lost dinosaur, but that was a Disney movie and it's not on Disney Plus, which I'm really upset. Like I wanted to watch that again, but I think there's a few things in that era of Disney's history that they're not too eager to kind of bring back and give us.
Yeah, it was also, we've talked about comics and movies and things, but there were a fair number of books too that mentioned, well, I guess all kinds of things. There's that first book, the Lungfish, the Dodo, and the Unicorn.
Yes, by Willie Ley, who's a very interesting person on like so much of not just a lot of science fact, but science fiction in general comes out of this work. So he was a guy who was interested in many, many things, among them rocketry initially. So he was part of the pre-Nazi German rocket program, like with Werner von Braun. He actually was a science consultant on this space travel movie that Fritz Lang did after Metropolis called Woman in the Moon, which invents the countdown for the rocket launch, which apparently came from Willy Ley. When the Nazis came to power, Willy Ley basically forged a passport, came to the U.S., which again, all his friends in the rocket program did not, but they got reunited anyway when they got recruited, taken to the U.S. after the war. So he is not part of Operation Paperclip, but essentially all his friends were. But afterwards, he becomes friends with Arthur C. Clarke. He becomes friends with Walt Disney. So I mean, he works on a lot of stuff, especially with the space program, but he's also very interested in what he calls romantic zoology, what comes to be known as cryptozoology, stuff like searching for Bigfoot, searching for the Loch Ness Monster. So he writes this book. I think the original version came out in the early 40s, but he expanded it after the war ended when there was the paper regulations and all that were relaxed. And the main version in 1948 is called The Lungfish, the Dodo, and the Unicorn, I believe. It's a mix of things that are legitimate, like the title says, the dodo, looks at dragon myths, various like mythical stuff, but also things like the Mokele Mbembe, things like hairy man sightings. So again, it's this early example of cryptozoology, but showing how it's coming from this overlap of actual interest in scientific biology, I guess we could say, and mythical biology and speculative evolution, perhaps.
Yeah, that's interesting. That is sort of usually the most dangerous type of pseudoscience, where the person mixes reality with not reality, and you think, oh, this person's an expert. That lines up with this thing this other person said. This must just be an expansion of that. There are unicorns and dragons.
Exactly.
I couldn't imagine having lungfish and dodo. It's like, okay, yeah, those are interesting creatures. And then unicorn. It's like quite a leap from dodo to unicorn, that title.
There is some evidence that some of these speculations that in later books he wrote that Willy Ley kind of withdrew from, I think, outright believing some of this stuff. And I think there's also an argument that in some of these cases he's kind of just more interested in the existence of these myths than taking them literally. But at the same time, he's the one who's putting out a lot of this stuff as well. And then other people then take up, particularly Bernard Heuvelmans, who becomes really the main, one of the two big proponents of cryptozoology, who is very adamant that, the Mokele Mbembe is real. He was very obsessed with the idea that Neanderthals still existed, and that, essentially like all fairies, all leprechauns, all gnomes and these are all just people seeing Neanderthals. So it's
that's fun.
This is the kind of guy who really runs with like the Mokele Mbembe, among other things as well.
Yeah, it's fun to see how people can try to connect these things and think about like, if this was real, assuming it is real, then how does that work? And usually it's always interesting, but then it can take a turn towards unbelievable pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Yes, very quickly.
Pretty much immediately.
Yeah. And then kind of branch out, and then you got all these different branches and
Well, and that's one of the interesting things. It's like a lot of people in, I guess you could say, the broader paranormal community, I guess like in the more modern day, at least, you might think, like, all right, someone who believes in UFOs, they're in their own corner. Bigfoot is in their own. But if you actually read a lot of these reports, even like from decades ago, it's generally like people who believe in one thing will tend to believe in the other. Like there's a lot of stuff about how like, people with psychic powers are alleged psychic powers, I should say, are, using their psychic powers to observe, Bigfoot's coming out of UFO. So it's just all this kind of paranormal stuff really is, in a general overlap. And there's some exceptions, but I think in general, there is a general overlap. There's a archaeologist, Jeb Card, who's written a lot of this, and he calls this the puffed paranormal unified field theory.
That's awesome. The unifying theory of paranormals. Yeah, that's funny. I remember there's one example I always hear of the psychic Bigfoot, where they're like, no one ever sees Bigfoot because Bigfoot is psychic, so it knows when people are coming and it can hide. It's like, that is a fantastical way to explain that.
Or I always like the idea that Bigfoot was like some alien pet who got left behind when he didn't come back from the trip when the saucer left. There's also people who claim that Bigfoot is like an alien prisoner, and it's like Earth is a penal colony, and the flying saucer just dropping off these convict Bigfoots to hang around the Pacific Northwest or whatever.
Yeah. Oh man, that's so funny. That's definitely what you'd do with prisoners. You'd turn them into astronauts and fly them light years away.
So going on to your other article, the megalodon, a monster of the new mythology. I bring this up now because that is interesting. It sounds like you're saying with megalodon, it's not as common to talk about, trying to find a real life megalodon today.
It's not as, I mean, there still are, some people who see it. Like, I think I mentioned in the article just this past May 2021, for anyone listening far in the future, but on TikTok, there's this whole wave of, people thinking that, they had seen a megalodon, which, they have not. And TikTok itself, that's a whole breeding ground of a lot of stuff that's not in the reality-based community. But so it once in a while, there is still kind of an upsurge, but I think the megalodon is more in popular culture now, which again is kind of appropriate in that to some extent, the kind of renaissance of the megalodon did come through popular culture. But the idea, broadly that, the megalodon might still exist, this is something that comes, not like with the Mokele Mbembe or even Bigfoot, stuff like that, of, taking indigenous, Westerners aren't going to, some indigenous culture and saying, oh, they have a legend of a giant fish, it must be a megalodon. This is coming from Western science. It's coming from 19th century, the British Challenger expedition, one of the bedrocks of modern oceanographic science. They're dredging up these, giant megalodon teeth from the seafloor. There's people in London, misidentifying the age of these teeth to make it seem like, it's essentially, just, from yesterday, geologically speaking. So this is it's maybe a cautionary tale to some extent in that, we think of Western science as being rational versus, indigenous knowledges of various people, being pre-scientific, foul, interpreting and stuff. But this is a legend, a cryptozoological idea, which comes from Western science, was, from what was widely seen as this rational logical science. And ultimately, it turns out that these approaches were not all that accurate. But, from this idea of this giant prehistoric shark actually is still swimming around. And, that really comes out of a view of Western science, which then got amended. But of course, as with a lot of this stuff, not only with cryptozoology, but with things with like pseudo history in general, like with Great Zimbabwe, a lot of these proponents, of these views, they're not unscientific. They just accept a certain view of science and then will reject any revisions that come after it.
Yeah, that's sort of what makes pseudoscience, right? It's like it's scientific to a point, but then there's some sort of motivated reasoning behind it that leads it in a very specific direction that is no longer scientific.
Yeah. There's a geologist named Sharon Hill, and she recently, I think it was maybe 4 or 5 years ago, published a book called Scientifical Americans, which is how this modern pseudoscience movement emerges from people who think they know what the scientific method is. They think they know how scientists operate, but they don't really. So it's exploring like the idea of pseudoscience as people trying to essentially imitate what they think scientists do without having any of the expertise in the relevant fields or understanding of methodology.
Yeah. It's really not super complicated science. It's more about like disproving things. That's the thing people don't realize on the statistical side of it too, because most people will look at an anecdote and think that can be science. Like, I found this thing and it does this thing, therefore causation. It's like, well, you have to do a little more rigor than that in order to get the the causation. And it seems like that's where a lot of that pseudoscience stuff sits, where it's like one person does one thing, sees one picture of a Mokele Mbembe drawn by somebody and is like, that's proof. That's all we need. Now, like scientifically proven. It's like, that does not stand up to the rigor of proving that animal exists.
No. and I should say, I mentioned that my dissertation spun off this, completely unexpectedly. There's another big research project I'm working on, which is a history of flat earthers, which again came out of my dissertation, something I was not expecting going in. But again, there's a group of flat earthers who use scientific tools to, measure, the curvature of the earth. And, their very scientific instruments show them the earth is round. And even then, even though they say they believe in science, even though they're using scientific instruments correctly, even though they're then seeing the data, it's then, okay, well, the data is still going against my belief. So obviously the data is wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, the flat earth thing is one of the most interesting because people often think when you haven't spoken to a flat earther that it would be so simple to convince them because there are all these easy ways to show, that the earth is round. But you can rationalize anything if you're motivated. It becomes, it's no longer, it's just like a flat earth. Now it's a disk that's accelerating, and that's how you explain gravity. And the way the stars are there, they're also accelerating in the same way. And if you want, you can keep going down like more and more rabbit holes of different cross-linked, unifying theory, like you were saying, of pseudoscience.
And it is interesting with flat earth that in some respects, they're very open-minded because there's so many different schools. Is the earth a infinite plane? Is it, a single, disk? Is there, they have a bunch of different conceptions of, what the flat earth actually looks like or how it functions or who built it and stuff. But they're all happy to get along with each other as long as they all just agree there's, it's flat. You can quibble about everything else.
So I know you're working on a couple other projects. Can you tell us about them?
Yeah, I think maybe the one that's most relevant is on, again, kind of a spin-off of the dinosaur article, is on people who believe that woolly mammoths still existed. And that's actually very similar to the Mokele Mbembe, but one that's based in North America in particular in the 18th and 19th centuries. And it is interesting because, again, it ties in with ideas of, well, first of African knowledge, because it's in the early 1700s in South Carolina, where on the early English plantations, the slaves are digging up these bones. The plantation owners thinks these are the bones left over by the giants killed in Noah's flood. It's the African slaves who identify them as elephant bones. So you have the start of, and arguably the science of American paleontology comes from both the labor and the knowledge of Africans from the Congo that were brought over in the slave trade.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's something that really blew my mind when I first read about that. But it gets tied in with this early competition with Thomas Jefferson and Charles Buffoon, forgetting the specific name, about American greatness versus European greatness, and that America allegedly didn't have any giant animals, so it was a country doomed to degeneration. So again, part of the Lewis and Clark expedition was try to find some of these living giant animals whose bones had been left behind in South Carolina and Virginia. So I have a friend, Justin Mullis, who's argued that Thomas Jefferson is actually the first cryptozoologist because he believed that these things were still alive, and he actively, he used government money to try and find them. And it's as the expansion goes further west, it's the area where mammoths might still be living kind of slowly shrinks, from anywhere west of the Mississippi River to the Pacific Northwest to Alaska. It gets tied in also, the idea of mound cultures, the giant Native American mounds, and people arguing, woolly mammoths must have been used to build these, or this required so much manpower, the mammoths went extinct because the Native Americans had to eat the mammoths to get the workers fed to build these mounds. And so all these, very much like with Mokele Mbembe and Great Zimbabwe, you have these kind of pseudo historical notions tying in with colonial expansion, settler politics, appropriating these indigenous monuments and kind of inventing new cultures with them. So it's very similar to some of the stuff that I was working on in my dissertation, just happening in the Americas. in some cases about 200 years after, in some cases a bit before these things emerge in the African context.
You've got another project that you mentioned you're working on, has to do with dinosaurs living on Venus.
Yeah, so this is so I'm co-working on a book on the horror writer H.P. Lovecraft and his astronomical views and kind of like his views on space travel. So I'm working on this with an astronomer who's also a Lovecraft fan. But one of the few explicit science fiction stories Lovecraft wrote, this story called In the Walls of Eryx, is set on Venus. And he wrote this in the 1930s when people thought that Venus was this tropical planet, essentially, very off. But this is a common thing. And because of the conception of the solar system, it was believed that the planets formed from the outside in. So Mars is an older version of Earth. Venus is a younger version of Earth. So therefore, if Venus is this younger version of Earth, it's going to have, the younger equivalent of life. So in Lovecraft's story, there's all these, lizards on Venus. And I was reading into this whole trope about this. A man, Russell J. Hawley, actually wrote an article, Dinosaurs on Venus, that just explores this trope of just, almost from the beginning of in the 1800s of when people start writing science fiction novels about going to Venus. There's this trope, obviously they're going to find dinosaurs there. To the extent, I think one of my favorite examples of this, which I found independently, but it was a sign of, just how widespread this trope was. But I think it was the early 1930s in the Soviet Union, there's this story that this science fiction author is writing about after, the victory of the world communist revolution. The last capitalists are building a rocket to escape and go to Venus. But, the good proletarian comrades in the ship's crew, stage a mutiny and they fly to Venus and they drop the capitalists off and they get eaten by the dinosaurs on Venus. So right there, I love that when I found that.
That's just like the Bigfoot getting dropped off as a prisoner.
Right.
In the Northwest. Capitalists are the Bigfoot of Venus, apparently.
Exactly. Yep. There you go.
That is awesome.
Awesome. Well, one last question for our listeners. If they want to find out more about you and your work, is there a place they can go online?
Yeah, I would say I have a website which is perennially under construction, but the best place to find whatever I'm rambling about now, it's on Twitter. It's at Edward_Guimont. I'm sure you can find that pretty easily, but usually whatever my new work is, I'm going to post about it there. And one of these days I will actually finish the website.
Well, it sounds like you've got a lot of other projects in the works too, so
yeah,
I know, it's
understandable.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. I had a great time.
Us too. Thank you so much again, Eddie, for coming onto our show. We had a great time chatting and learning about even more dinosaur connections.
Oh, yeah. They come up everywhere.
Mm-hmm. And now onto our dinosaur of the day, Fabrosaurus, which was a request from Tyrant King via our Patreon and Discord, so thanks. It was a basal ornithischian dinosaur that lived in the late Triassic, early Jurassic, in what is now Lesotho, the Elliot Formation. It walked on two legs, it had a long body and a short head and short arms, and it looked a lot like Lesothosaurus. And actually, some scientists think that Fabrosaurus specimens represent individual variations of Lesothosaurus.
Yeah, like we were talking about with Coelophysis, there was a lot of the plasticity in how they developed. So, yeah, you might get some that look different than others, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're a different animal.
Yeah. So for context, Lesothosaurus was about 3 feet or 1 meter long.
That is small.
Mm-hmm. Fabrosaurus was herbivorous. The type species is Fabrosaurus australis. It was described in 1964 by Leonard Ginsberg, and the genus name means Fabre's lizard. It was named in honor of Jean Fabre, a geologist and one of Ginsberg's colleagues in the expedition where they found the fossil. The species name refers to the fossil being found on the southern part of the Elliot Formation. So it means southern in Latin. So Fabre's southern lizard. The holotype was a partial jawbone, mandible, with 3 teeth. And then more fossils were found later, including 2 crushed skulls, vertebrae, ribs, and limb bones. Ginsburg described the holotype as thin and gracile and the teeth as straight and triangular in profile, and said that the teeth were ornithischian teeth, similar to Scelidosaurus harrisoni. It was described as a, quote, dinosaur of a small size with single-rooted teeth possessing long vertical roots, end quote. And originally Ginsburg said that Fabrosaurus was a Scelidosaurid. But then more ornithischian fossils were found later, and scientists found that Fabrosaurus had too many features in common with other species, so then Fabrosaurus became a nomen dubium. Then in 1992, Richard Thulburn said that Fabrosaurus and Lesothosaurus were synonymous.
Getting lumped.
Yes, and then in 2005, Richard Butler reviewed ornithischians from the Elliot Formation and said Fabrosaurus was, quote, based upon a single undiagnostic dentary, end quote, and considered it to be a nomen dubium. So just not enough unique features.
So 2 Richards took it from being a valid genus to being synonymized and then finally just being completely undiagnostic.
I guess that is one way to put it, yeah.
Richards headed out for the Fabrosaurus.
I suppose so.
And our fun fact of the day goes back to our Menucocelsior dinosaur discovery. And in that paper, the authors mentioned that there are over 50 named species of sauropods in Patagonia alone.
That's so many.
That is a lot. That is way more than the total number of all the ankylosaurs in the world.
More reason for us to visit Patagonia.
I guess so. 32 of those sauropods are from the Neuquén Basin, most of those being titanosaurs. And the Neuquén Basin includes the Allen Formation, which means that Menucocelsior, being in the Allen Formation, is among those 32. So until this paper was published, I guess there were 31. Now we're up to 32. More than one for every day of the month, even in the longest months.
Excellent. What a great fact to end on.
Yeah, it was a short but sweet one this week. I can't remember last time my fun fact was the short.
I was thinking mostly because it was about sauropods.
That too.
And that wraps up this episode of I Know Dino. Thank you so much for listening. Again, it's not too late to sign up to our Patreon so that you get access to our bonus content where we'll be talking about some of the non-dinosaurs covered in next week's Society of Vertebrate Paleontology Conference. Woohoo! Very exciting. It's patreon.com/iknowdino. Thanks again, and until next time.